Witajcie. Chciałbym zaprezentować wypowiedź amerykańskiego generała Douglasa MacGregora, ale najpierw chciałbym przedstawić tą postać, żeby mieć kontekst jego wypowiedzi i kim on w ogóle jest. Urodzony 4 stycznia 1953 roku, jest emerytowanym pułkownikiem armii amerykańskiej i urzędnikiem państwowym, a także autorem, konsultantem i komentatorem telewizyjnym. W 2020 roku prezydent Donald Trump zaproponował MacGregora jako ambasadora w Niemczech, ale Senat zablokował nominację. 11 listopada 2020 rzecznik Pentagonu ogłosił, że MacGregor został zatrudniony jako starszy doradca sekretarza obrony, stanowisko, które piastował przez mniej niż 3 miesiące. No i tu mamy jego karierę wojskową, czyli chłop bardzo doświadczony. Tu wzmianka. Przykładowo MacGregor dowodził kontyngentem 49 pojazdów bojowych w ostatniej wielkiej bitwie czołgów XX wieku, nie ponosząc żadnych strat.
That's not quite what the Washington Post is suggesting, which I think may be something else. But let's talk a little bit about this conflict, which has evolved considerably over the last 7 months. Conflicts are not static. War is an ever-changing sea, if you will. And for the last 7 months, even though people in the West will never ever admit it, the truth is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint with regard to the use of his military power. We've never seen more than 20% of the Russian ground force in Ukraine. And most of the regular Russian ground force was subsequently withdrawn after the first 4 months, during which the Ukrainian army that we built over several years was largely destroyed. What you have in Ukraine now is a mix of various volunteer organizations, militias, some allied forces like the Chechens, Kuban Cossack volunteer organizations. They've turned out to be very good fighters, plus the Wagner mercenary group. It's also turned out to be very effective on the ground. But the real Russian army, with its combat forces, has largely pulled out of the fight. I thought they would come back in August, but apparently the decision was made not to do that. And what's happened now, I think, in the Kremlin is that Mr. Putin and his advisors have all concluded there's no chance of negotiating an end to this conflict. I think he really clung to that hope, even in the middle of April, when it was clear that we in London would not permit Zelensky and Kyiv to make any sort of a compromise, to accept neutrality, for instance, off the table. So now we're dealing with a different Russia. And what you saw yesterday in 3 waves were 202 missiles and loitering munitions attacking specific targets all over Ukraine. This is something that they've always been able to do. They have the precision-guided munitions and missiles, just as we do. This time, they not only hit so-called critical infrastructure, they also hit the secret police headquarters of the Ukrainian state, which is a notorious organization engaged in murdering people and forcing people into enemy gunfire at gunpoint, recruiting at gunpoint. But they also hit a number of analyst cells, places where people are putting together intelligence pictures. In other words, they've signaled that there's nothing happening in Western Ukraine that Moscow doesn't know about. And they've also signaled there's nothing over there they can't reach and destroy. So I think we're seeing a glimpse of what's going to happen later on this fall, which I predict will be major offensives on the ground once the soil freezes. That's coming. And this will be much closer to what a lot of us thought would happen at the very beginning. Massive offensives designed to utterly annihilate what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces.
The Western media is trying to paint these Russian airstrikes, these attacks, as inconsequential. that they're not really hurting Ukraine. I've heard this from a few propaganda mainstream media outlets over the past 24 hours. And I'm just going through the laundry list of targets. I mean, hitting Polish forces that were amassed and ready to invade Russia proper, hitting NATO targets, hitting, as you mentioned, the SBU, hitting thermal power plants. There are people who are fleeing Ukraine in droves right now because they have no fresh water, they have no running water, they have no electricity, they have no internet. So the Western media says these attacks were inconsequential. Ukraine's fine. What do you say to that?
President Biden apparently felt compelled to call, or at least his handlers felt compelled to have President Biden call Mr. Zelensky, reassure him that we will continue to supply him, that we back him, there will be no change. And at the same time, Mr. Zelensky pleaded with more air defense systems because the Russian attacks also destroyed 80% of Ukrainian air defenses. So if someone is suggesting this was not consequential, we have to look at those developments and we rapidly conclude, no, that's wrong. Mr. Zelensky is in a panic, unquestionably. They've got serious logistical problems, moving things around in the country. Suddenly, Russia has decided enough is enough. We're not going to exercise the restraint we have in the past.
Talking about the air defense system specifically, Ukrainian President Zelensky, as you mentioned, just asked for more weapons, just asked for specifically air defense weapons. The U.S. appears to be going along with it. The United States throwing their support, happy always to supply weapons wherever they are needed. What will this do for Ukraine? Air defense systems. Explain how those would work and who would man. Are they unmanned? Would these be NATO soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers who would be manning these air defense systems?
Well, keep in mind that the so-called HIMARS system, which is this high mobility rocket system, is largely manned by so-called contractors.
Right.
Presumably, that consists of Americans in civilian clothes working on contract for the Ukrainian government via some other mechanism that we've created. Could also be Europeans. But these systems take a long time to learn how to operate, let alone maintain. Now, something called NASAMS, which is a surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missile system designed to protect point targets with a very complex radar system, it's one of the best in the world, was in Kyiv, and it's being destroyed. The way you overwhelm point air defense systems is that you launch lots of missiles and rockets. And eventually you're going to overwhelm any system, regardless of how good it is. That's what the Russians did in this operation. They targeted air defense sites and overwhelmed them. So yes, Mr. Zelensky wants more of these, but then he's also got to have contractors operate them because his soldiers are not trained to do it.
So where do NATO forces play in the rest of this? Now, if we talk about this turning point, this decimation of the Ukrainian military, I've heard, you talk about this before, but you're eliminating their best soldiers, whatever's left of the Ukrainian military, as they're being drawn out, they're being eliminated. To replace them is not easy, and arguably, I guess you're replacing them with NATO soldiers or contractors. Who's going to fill the, who's going to man the ship once the rest of the Ukrainian army is destroyed?
Well, the people engaged in direct fire combat on the ground are Ukrainians. Now, there are reports of large numbers of Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform making up for losses that occurred over the last few months. Because, as you point out, most of Ukrainians' best forces are gone. They've been killed or wounded. Ukrainians have lost roughly 100,000 dead, perhaps 2, 3, even 400,000 wounded.
Wow.
They started out with an army of 600,000. Remember, we spent 8 years building this army up with the express purpose of attacking Russia. That's what it was designed to do. That's why the Russians attacked it. And ultimately, we wanted to put missiles into eastern Ukraine with which we could threaten Russia. So again, eastern Ukraine had to be neutralized, and that's why the Russians intervened. But the Russians, as I pointed out earlier, have always exercised great restraint because, first of all, this is another Slavic country, another Orthodox Christian Slavic country. They're not interested in killing large numbers of people. They didn't want to destroy a lot of infrastructure. The areas where Russian forces are sitting in southern and eastern Ukraine were already Russian. They simply wanted to guarantee equal rights for the Russians in Ukraine with other Ukrainian citizens. That was the point of the Minsk agreements, which were never honored. So the bottom line is, at this point, you're looking at cannon fodder. People without much training being rounded up, put into uniform, handed an AK-47, put behind machine guns, whatever else, put into tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Do they get training? Some have had good training, but the vast majority haven't had much. So the casualties have been very high. But once you move above the tactical level and you move up to what we would call division or corps levels, you find NATO staffs are actually running the show. In other words, people from France, Great Britain, the United States, other countries are doing the systematic planning and setting forth proposals for what should happen next.
Right.
There's a lot of evidence that the Ukrainian president has not taken our advice very well, and he's determined to attack, largely because I think he sees himself in a position where he has everything to lose and not much more to gain. So he thinks he can wear down the Russians. The problem is, for every one Russian killed or wounded, you have 5, 6, or 7 Ukrainians being killed or wounded. So for the Russians, they've economized. They've run a fairly cheap, inexpensive defense, while the Ukrainians have run very expensive offenses. So now Ukraine is in a very serious crisis. It may not survive, particularly when this major offensive begins in November, December timeframe and the ground is frozen. I don't know what the Ukrainians will do, because then they will face the regular Russian army, large numbers of Russian army troops, not just volunteers and allied units, but the Russian army. And it will have the operational freedom to do what many Russians wanted to do at the beginning, which is anything that we suspect is dangerous or threatening to us can be targeted and destroyed. So it'll be a very different war that's coming.
And so you see that happening in November, coming up here in the next few weeks, this amassing of forces. Yeah. I think a lot of people have been wondering, when is that going to occur? You see that happening within the next few weeks.
Well, let's be frank, I'm not on distribution from the Russian general staff. But right. When I look at the arrival of Russian forces in the theater, and they're arriving in groups of 50,000 spread around Ukraine in various places. They're doing a lot of training and preparation right now. They will then move to axes, operational axes of advance, something we expected to see at the beginning of the war that we did not see. And then they will strike very hard and very deep. And whatever is still in front of Russian forces in Ukraine will be annihilated. That will be their mission: destroy them, annihilate them. Now, where will the Russians stop? I suspect they'll stop at the Dnieper River. They've never been interested in crossing that. They don't want to go into what is historically Ukraine, which is west of the river. That's where the Ukrainians live. They're not Russified. They are real Ukrainians. He doesn't want to go over there. But he's going to take Odessa. He's going to take Kharkov. These cities will be taken once and for all as a result of these offenses. And then there's not a great deal we can do, anybody in the West, unless they want to go to war with Russia. I see no appetite anywhere in Europe for anyone to go to war with Russia, with a possible exception of the Poles. And even there, the consensus supporting war against Russia is cracking, slowly but surely. In the United States, no one's even interested. Everybody's talking about the hurricane that struck Florida. No one really cares what happens in Ukraine. That's why we've gotten away with so many bad policy decisions, because Americans didn't pay attention. Well, they're not really paying much attention now, but they're beginning to see that perhaps everything they were told about this is wrong.
Yeah, and you've been one of the keenest voices on this, providing that truth, and that's what we try to do here on this show. And we've been saying Odessa. We've been talking about Odessa over the past few weeks on this show. That will be key. At this point, it's not been obviously not part of the referenda, but if pushed, Odessa will fall. It will become part of Russia. And then what? Ukraine landlocked, no access to water. What becomes of Ukraine, and what becomes of Zelensky once that happens?
Well, that's anybody's guess. I couldn't even begin to conjecture what would happen to Zelensky. He could be removed by his own people. He could simply get onto an aircraft and fly to one of his mansions in Miami or Venice or somewhere else that have been provided to him. I have no idea. But as far as the Russians are concerned, Odessa has always been a Russian city. It was never part of Ukraine. The same thing is true for Kharkov. These were Russian cities from the very, very beginning, and they were Russian speaking. Now, that doesn't mean Ukrainians haven't moved in there, and they have in many cases. In Odessa, for instance, almost 50% of the population now consists of Ukrainians because they pushed a lot of Russians out.
Right.
But from the vantage point of Moscow at this stage, they're not going to tolerate that nonsense any longer. They're going to take these places. But they're going to do it as the Russians always do things, very methodically, very deliberately. And this new commander who's just been named is a very able person. He has a great reputation. He did good work in Syria for the Russians. And he is a tough-minded individual. He's now going to have forces, and he's going to have capabilities at his disposal that his predecessors have never had. That's why I think the Washington Post suggested this is a turning point. They're right. It is. It may not be what they think, but it's a turning point.
Maybe also part of this turning point, and I'll get you out of here on this question, Colonel, which is about Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko on Monday, said that Belarus and Russia have agreed now to deploy a military joint force in response to tensions along the western borders. Lukashenko also said that Ukraine is discussing plans to launch attacks on Belarus. So this is a preemptive move. Can you speak to that?
I can only tell you that Belarusia has a population of perhaps 8 million. So it's, even though its landmass is large, its population is small. Its army has not modernized over the last several decades, and the Russians are now trying to hastily modernize it, provided new equipment, new communications equipment, perhaps even new tactical organization. That will not happen overnight. What I think we're talking about now is the Russians coming in, integrating with the Belarusians, and they speak the same language. There's no longer any great distinction between so-called White Russia and Great Russia. There was, but certainly not since the Second World War. And I think they'll be more concerned about defending the border against any interest that Poland may have in attacking them. Because remember, Minsk is a city that was historically in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it's this notion of a White Russia. It was further east. So you've got all of these historical interests at play. And this is the final point that I need to make. We have no role in this. This is not part of our world. And the only interest we have in this place is in bringing peace to it. Right. We should be working to end this thing, not make it worse. Because if we try to make it worse, it will spread and engulf others for the reasons I just outlined. There are many people, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, they all have agendas that involve territory, populations. And that's not our agenda. We don't want to be involved in that. We just want them to get through this with minimal loss of life and get back to business. And if you're going to argue, well, the Russian army is too small and too incompetent to threaten anyone, but on the other hand, that Mr. Putin harbors the ambition to conquer Europe and invade NATO, you can't have them both ways.
Right.
So the point is, no, there's no interest in attacking NATO, and there's no interest in a war with NATO. We should recognize that and find as quickly as possible a solution that people can live with. It won't be as good as it would have been several months ago. Ukraine is going to look at the loss of territory, but this has happened repeatedly over 1,000 years in Europe. This is nothing new. You have to make peace, and that will include some changes that some people may not like.
Well, we've been calling for peace on this show from the very beginning, and I think absolutely right now would be a wonderful time for them to come back to the table and say enough is enough. Enough is enough.
Yes.
I agree with you on that. Colonel, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll come back on the show. We hope it may perhaps it's under better circumstances.
Sure. Great to talk with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Colonel.
Bye-bye.
То есть, если Украина получает выдачу в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупная военная операция России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно брали.
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно, Россия, не НАТО. Мы не они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирать Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весах, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
А что такое может быть крупная война с Россией? Вот.
Ну, это воздушная операция наступательная, вторжение российских армий, вот 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там, осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в АТО находятся, ВОЗ, операция объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Каховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать, наступление с территории Беларуси, там, создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее, воздушный десант. Вот что такое полноценная война. И вероятность ее 99%.
Когда?
После 21-22 самые критические, 20-22 самые критические эти самые.